My mother, Josephine, has three sisters, Anna Mae, Rosemarie, God rest her soul, and her youngest sister, Andrea. I have met only two of those sisters. The third I haven't met as a direct result of the sin of racism. And I'm not being dramatic. Let me explain. The year was 1963, 1964, somewhere in there. My Aunt Andrea was the first of her family to go to college, and she went off to be an exchange student in Paris for a year or so. And it's Paris. She was enjoying the culture and the beat culture of that time in that city, and she fell in love with a jazz musician who happened to be an African-American guy. They lived together for a period of time, so I imagine, and she came to be with child. And they came back to the United States to bring their joy of their relationship and this coming child to my grandmother and the family. Let's just say that good news was not warmly welcomed at all, matter of fact. Words were spoken that shouldn't have been said. Who knows what they said about what they should do about the child, or let alone get married. It was 1963 in the Italian neighborhood of Poughkeepsie, New York, not in the Deep South, and this was not anything anyone could deal with. Now, whether my aunt was too brash, or her kinfolk, or my mother, or my grandmother too not able to deal with this, whatever it was clear. The brothers-in-law, my father and a brother-in-law of his, suggested to my Aunt Andrea that she should leave. She should go. It's too much for your mother to handle. And so she did. Left the city of Poughkeepsie, never to return to this day. I've never met my aunt. She lives in Staten Island, and people have reached out to her over the years. But I think whether it was what was said or so much of how it all went down, interracial marriage was not acceptable. Better to leave the family. That's the way things were done back in those days. And I was born into a family that put all of that under the covers. Not a word was spoken about it. Every now and then it would come up, but basically you could feel it. It's palpable, but not spoken. The sin of racism was deep in the family, and no one had a way of reconciling it at that time. It's hard to change one's mind. It's hard to move forward. It was 1963 and things were changing, but not fast enough, or maybe too fast for others. Jesus today has to have his mind changed. And you can look at this gospel passage at a number of different prisms, but I suggest in the summer of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd that perhaps we should look at this scripture passage through the prism of race and culture and intolerance. Because Jesus labels this woman who comes to her what only could be described in our day and time as an ethnic slur. Calls her and her daughter dogs. It's the darkest moment, I think, in Scripture. And for Jesus to utter it, whether it was the sentiment of his community or Jesus himself, who knows? But he said it. You can't unsay things like that. You can't unhear things like that if you're a mother fighting for her daughter. But this woman does have great faith. And she has faith enough to get past that. Because she knows intuitively, and her faith tells her, that Jesus' father is the God of Israel, the God of Jacob and the God of Joseph, the God who frees people from enslavement, the God who we will come to know from St. Paul, who comes to Jew and Greek alike, slave and free alike. She knows this, and she maybe reminds Jesus of who he is and whose son he is and that the Father is Father to all of them, to her, her daughter, and Jesus himself. And Jesus changes his mind. Perhaps easier because he's divine as well as human, and he has to get past his human side, but he does. And he blesses this woman and grants her miracle. All through Scripture we've heard today, every Scripture passage we have heard says clearly to us that God is the God of all nations and of all peoples. He deals equitably with all. There are no scraps that fall on the floor in Jesus' world, as there might be in our world today, where people fight for the scraps of health care or for equal justice under the law, or they fight for right pay for a good day's work, scraps for some people in our culture. God's world is not like that at all. And he's begging cultures and peoples from generation to generation, from Old Testament to New Testament, to know and understand that all are created equal. And racism, as Gloria Purvis said, an EWTN commentator, racism makes God a liar. Because when we play anything of that card, it immediately says that God is not God of all. It takes time, though, and trauma. And Isaiah can only talk about God being for all the foreigners after they had come back from the exile, from that awful humiliation, come back to rebuild the temple. And Isaiah is saying, in all humility, it is time to see God in all people, in all nations. But it takes time. And like I say, it takes trauma, too. And you have to encounter one-on-one your connection with culture, race, and people who are different. And have your heart be circumcised in God's love. To see with the eyes of God and not the eyes of a person who might see color or race or class, but to see the heart, as Jesus was told to do. But it's hard. And it took 35 years, I think it was, until my mother got up the gumption to knock on my aunt's door in Staten Island. Thanks to Google, you can find people. Before it's like, oh no, we don't know where she is, we don't know where she could be held. So the next generation, as it takes generations for things to change, to open up the Google and to find my aunt. And it didn't take too many clicks. But my mother walked up to the door, and she would encounter her sister all those years later, 50 plus. Maybe not 50 at that point, 35. And there would be no reconciliation. Too much time had passed. No one had come to see her, nor the other way around. My mother apologized and regretted her words, but my aunt said it was over. So there would be no reconciliation per se, but there was the attempt, which is always pleasing in God's eyes. But that's not the end of the story, because shortly at that point, my cousin, also named Andrea, announced to the family that she had found love herself. She'd come out of the closet, and she introduced us to Donna. And almost immediately, my father and my mother were there for her, and soon to be her wife, in a way that was astounding. I think my mother and father both knew what the pain is when we don't allow people to love who they love, however they love. It's not worth sending people away and severing family. They had learned slowly and painfully what it's all about. And so my dad walked Donna down the aisle about 7 years ago, and my mom was a matron of honor for Andrea, her niece. And it was a moment, I think, in which our family could move forward from the unspoken and from the pain that is caused when we don't see what God sees. And so on this Sunday, I tell my story of race and difficulty. All of us in this country are telling these stories. And hopefully, as we reflect and see things in different light, may we see Christ walking through it all. Christ who, like us, had his mind changed, and he's calling us to change our hearts and minds if they need to be. He gives us himself and this Eucharist so that we might know that there is more than enough in his heavenly banquet. There are no scraps, only gifts of plenty in his presence.